A Muslim, a Jew, and a Pythagorean walk into a bar. This isn't a joke. This is simply the framing device for Reuchlin's De Arte Cabalistica, published in 1517, near the tail end of the Reuchlin-Pfefferkorn affair. In keeping with a literary tradition stretching back through men like Raymond Lull and Petrus Alfonsi, all the way back to the Socratic dialogues of Plato, the De Arte Cabalistica took the form of an interreligious dialogue between men of different faiths. Note, however, that unlike Raymond Lull's Book of the Gentile and the Three Wise Men from around 1274, or before it Petrus Alfonsi's dialogue against the Jews, the Christian character who always inevitably wins such imaginary debates is conspicuously missing. Reuchlin's own 1494 work, De Verbo Mirifico, on the wonder-working word, was one such dialogue wherein the character Capnio, Reuchlin's pen name, squares off against the Jewish character Baruch, debating over the theme of divine names and their use in ceremonies, only for Capnio to pull out a secret Christological trump card that puts an end to the debate. Now, here in De Arte Cabalistica, instead of a Christian in conversation with the characters Simon the Jew and Maranus, the cosmopolitan Muslim, we get a Pythagorean named Philolaus, after the alleged pre-Socratic Pythagorean author of the Golden Verses. In the Prisca Theologia narrative of Proclus's Platonic theology, that is not the modified Hermetic version devised by Ficino, this Philolaus sat between Pythagoras and Plato in the chain of transmission of the ancient theology stretching down from Zoroaster. But why did Reuchlin devise such a dialogue between three ostensibly non-Christian thinkers this time around? Why this shift away from a polemical tone? And why, more generally, do Greek philosophy and Jewish Kabbalah seem to have so many similarities that such a dialogue as this one might even be a plausible literary frame? While much like the Renaissance philosophers Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino, and based on what his literary evidence could allow him to conceive, Johannes Reuchlin believed that Pythagoras and his Pythagorean followers owed their secret doctrines to the Hebrews, particularly to Moses, who received them directly from God on Mount Sinai. This claim may seem fantastical, but it was very popular among Renaissance intellectuals for a variety of reasons, and it profoundly informed their visions of the history of philosophy. For men like Pico and Reuchlin, Moses had been the very first to use the written word, and he had used it to convey the exoteric portion of the law, which God himself had carved in stone. The esoteric portion, however, had been conveyed orally, in secret, from master to initiate, over generations and generations, until the fragments of such a secret teaching, like crystalline shards, had spread among the ancient sages of all nations, from Egypt and Persia to Greece and Italy. During the Renaissance, and in keeping with an idea from the Middle Platonist Numenius's book On the Good, and preserved in the writings of the Church Father Eusebius, so-called Pythagoreanism enjoyed explicit resurgence as a point of commonality between Ficino, Pico, and Johannes Reuchlin. For Ficino and for Pico, Pythagoreanism had provided the authoritative foundations for their own philosophical master Plato. Timaeus and Parmenides, for example, were Pythagorean characters, and the body of wisdom these men taught was understood to be a direct descendant of those secrets imparted to Moses on Sinai. When Numenius had asked the rhetorical question, "What is Plato but Moses speaking Greek?" they took it literally. From this perspective, Renaissance scholars thought Pythagoras of Samos, the founder of an ascetic school in Crotona, in Calabria today, was actually the earliest Italian transmitter of Hebrew philosophy, especially in matters pertaining to the metaphysics of number and letter. In this belief, Pico had been explicit, That divine philosophy of Pythagoras, which they call magic, belongs to a great extent to the Mosaic tradition, since Pythagoras had managed to reach the Jews and their doctrine in Egypt, and knowledge of many of their sacred mysteries. Zoroaster, the son of Oromazius, in practicing magic, took that to be the cult of God and the study of divinity. While engaged in this in Persia, he most successfully investigated every virtue and power of nature, in order to know those sacred and sublime secrets of the divine intellect, which subject many people call theurgy, others Kabbalah or magic. Not only were the sacred mysteries of Pythagoras here made to correspond with magic and the secrets of the divine intellect, but also with theurgy and Kabbalah. Taking up Pico's baton, then, Reuchlin made the same equation, boldly proclaiming himself to his Medici patron to have restored the ancient southern Italian school of Pythagoreanism through his studies of the Kabbalah, first exposited in his 1494 De Verbo Mirifico, on the wonder-working word. For more on this De Verbo Mirifico, you can head over to Esoterica to watch Dr. Justin Sledge's exploration that was put together as a companion to this presentation. Now, the following excerpt is drawn from Reuchlin's De Arte Cabalistica, on the art of the Kabbalah, from 1517, specifically from his opening dedication to Pope Leo X, who was the second son of Lorenzo de' Medici, the famous patron of both Pico and Ficino's philosophical projects decades earlier. While these contain his more mature or developed thoughts on the perennial nature of Kabbalah and the Pythagorean philosophy, his ideas were relatively primitive in terms of outlining what had really undergone the formality of actually occurring in a critical reckoning of the history of philosophy. Philosophy in Italy was once upon a time handed down to men of great intellect and renown by Pythagoras, the father of that school. But over the years, it had been done to death by the sophists' wholesale vandalism, and lay long buried in obscurity's dark night, when by God's grace, that sun that shone on every field of liberal study, your father, Lorenzo de' Medici, son of the great Cosimo, rose up the chief citizen of Florence. We knew that his natural ability for affairs of state, his knowledge of such matters, and his wise handling of war and domestic policy were such that no man in politics was more worthy of praise than he. But it must be said that when, in addition to this, his scholarly activities are taken into account, his birth seems heaven-sent. Petrarch, Philelf, and Aretino brought the arts of oratory and fine speech to the youth of Florence, so that there could be no disputing that her people wrote more lucidly and spoke more accurately than any other nation. But it was your father who added to Florence's store of learning, wisdom that probes into the past, wisdom that lay hidden until his day in books and memorials of past times. Zealously he brought to his country learned men from every land, men familiar with ancient authors whose fluency equaled their scholarship. Demetrius Chalcondyles, Marsilio Ficino, Giorgio Vespuccio, Cristoforo Landino, Lorenzo Valla, Angelo Poliziano, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and others. Through them was the wisdom of the ancients, by misfortune lost or hidden, restored to the light of day. They were hard workers. One would teach, another write commentaries, one read, another interpret and translate. Marsilio put Greek into Latin, Poliziano put Latin into Greek. They were all eager, they were all greatly praised by the Medicis, and then, there among these heroes, you were born, most blessed Leo, as if some heavenly wand had been waved at the God-sent moment that would ensure your acquisition of the accomplishments of every field of the humanities, particularly since, as a boy, you were influenced by the urbane Poliziano's polished style. Say no more. Nothing flourished as did Florence then, as those dead arts were there reborn. No aspect of language or literature was left untouched by those celebrated men. The fame of such learning led me to visit Florence, not just for its magnificent palace, built by your grandfather Cosimo the Great, and quite unlike any other, but because I also wanted to see your father, the man who had given our generation so many advantages. Your father sowed the seeds of ancient philosophy in his children. With his son they will grow to reach the rooftops. In your reign shall we reap the harvest in every language: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Chaldaic, and Chaldean. Your Majesty is now offered books treating of all these languages, and under your direction the work your father began flourishes yet more lavishly, having found that, except for some desultory and obscure work in the Laurentian Academy, the work of Pythagoras alone has not been touched by scholars. I thought it might give you pleasure if I brought to light the beliefs of Pythagoras and his followers, that you might enjoy unknown authors in the Latin. For Italy's part, Marsilio Ficino has published Plato. Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples has brought out Aristotle for France. I shall complete the pattern, and for Germany, I, Capnion, that is, Reuchlin, shall bring out the reborn Pythagoras with your name at its head. His philosophy, however, I have been able to glean only from the Hebrew Kabbalah, since it derives its origin from the teachers of Kabbalah, and then was lost to our ancestors, disappearing from southern Italy into the cabalistic writings. For this reason, it was almost all destined for destruction, and I have therefore written of the symbolic philosophy of the art of Kabbalah so as to make Pythagorean doctrine better known to scholars. I take no sides in all this. I tell my story as an outsider. In my tale, two men come separately to Frankfurt in order to visit one Simon, a Jew with knowledge of Kabbalah. They meet at an inn. They are Philolaus, a young follower of Pythagoreanism, and Maranus, a Muslim. Depositing their luggage at the inn, the travelers want a meal, but shudder at the riotous jollity of the crowd there, and leave the tap room once they have dined. They begin a conversation. So you see, I really wasn't kidding when I said a Muslim, a Jew, and a Pythagorean walk into a bar is the framing device for this book. Now, in making this equation between Pythagoreanism, Kabbalah, and ancient Hebrew wisdom, the humanist theologians Ficino, Pico, and Reuchlin were not so much talking about resurrecting the practices of silent asceticism, vegetarianism, or a belief in metempsychosis, though there was some of this floating around too. It's just not their point of emphasis. What these Renaissance men believed themselves to be resurrecting was its peculiar approach to purificatory contemplative mysticism, and in particular its focus on the realist doctrine that spirit was intrinsic to number, letter, and word, and read in their spiritual sense, they ultimately served as gateways toward reunion with pure spirit, namely, God. For Reuchlin, the vis verborum, or the power of words, lay in a series of links. If God was spiritus, spirit, the word constituted the spiratio, the outward breath, and man, the spirans, the one breathing. Man conceived of God in his mind, and this very conception was a product of the Word. Thus, God had chosen both the insensible seat of the mind and the sensible mansion of words, by means of which he makes a covenant with man, and used it to unite man with himself. Not arbitrary, but real were the links between signifiers and the thing signified, an idea which flew in the face of the late medieval nominalist schoolmen who held fast to the realism-shattering doctrines of the so-called via moderna. For an example of how this realist view was thought to operate philosophically, we can turn to the words of Pico della Mirandola's Heptapolis, who explained that, since the three worlds, the terrestrial, celestial, and supracelestial, are drawn together by the chains of concord, all these worlds change names as well as natures with mutual liberality. From this principle, if perhaps someone has not yet perceived it, has flowed the discipline of all allegorical interpretation. Nor were the ancient fathers able to represent correctly some things through the figures of others, unless they were taught, as I have said, the occult friendships and affinities of all of nature. Otherwise, there would be no reason why they should have represented one thing by this image, or that by another rather than the contrary. But expert in all things, and moved by that Spirit who not only knows all things, but made them, they would aptly symbolize the natures of one world through that which they knew corresponded to them in the other worlds. Therefore, those who wish to interpret rightly the figures and the allegorical sense of the Church Fathers need the same knowledge, unless the same Spirit come to them as well. Now, the Cabalists, as good God-fearing realists themselves, would not have disagreed with such an assessment on how symbols and the objects of this world are connected, and those who practice various types of gematria would most certainly be in agreement that all of reality was undergirded by number, and such formal numbers were, of course, best represented by the first and earliest alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. It's thanks to the mysteries of the Hebrew letters that the very words which constituted Holy Scripture, those words which had been beamed from the mind of God into the mind of Moses through the medium of Spirit, also masked higher, more abstract linguistic and numerical realities, waiting only for one with a spiritual understanding to pierce through the surface meaning and on into its deeper correspondences and concordances. It had not been for nothing that Philo of Alexandria and Augustine of Hippo, writing under the influence of the Platonic tradition, had both occasionally relied on Pythagorean numerology to explain certain biblical texts. In De Civitate Dei, the aged bishop of Hippo wrote, "We should not belittle the theory of numbers, for its great value is eminently clear to the attentive student in many passages of Holy Scripture. The praises of God do not for nothing include this statement, 'Thou hast ordered all things by measure and number and weight.'" Thanks to ancient and authoritative precedents such as these, delving into ostensibly Pythagorean ideas in the study of Scripture would not have seemed unorthodox to medieval Christians, but perfectly natural. I should note here that in the De Civitate Dei 735, Augustine had attacked Pythagoras himself as a necromancer who relied on occult rituals and divined with blood, but for some reason I still don't understand, this picture had very little influence on the medieval image of Pythagoras, except for some artwork like this, of him hanging out with Numa Pompilius and a pool party of demons. Given the importance of number to the concept of henosis, not mercantile numbers, not the numbers of things, of course, but formal numbers, another important theme common to Christianity, Kabbalah, and Pythagoreanism was the doctrine of man's purification and subsequently his salvation. Man had to ascend through the three worlds through the world of sense, on into the world of intelligibles, and then from there on into the unintelligible world of the divine, the darkness beyond all light, as described by the mystical theology of Dionysius the Areopagite. In Reuchlin's cosmic vision, there was no higher good than the unio mystica, the unification of man with God, wherein lay his ultimate salvation and felicitas, or perfect happiness. God's most ardent desire was that he be made one with man, his creation, or vice versa, that man be made one with God, but only man had to purify himself to achieve this blessed union, since a pure and holy God cannot be united with that which is imperfect and impure. To be purified was to be simplified, and to be simplified was to be made like God. And this triadic pursuit of purification, illumination, and perfection was common to every Hebrew Kabbalist, Pythagorean, and Christian. Like so many other works emerging during this time, De Arte Cabalistica was about the goal of the sage, though its goals were altogether different from those laid out in the other books of philosophy and magic. Let us hear then from the dialogue's character, Simon the Jew, who explains to his companions what Reuchlin's vision of Kabbalah was really all about. Dear Pythagoreans, this I know, that God has given to men who walk upon the earth nothing they could more desire than this contemplative art, and that Cabalists more than others possess robust intellects and fertile minds, and that nothing admits more of the search for salvation in this world and everlasting life in the next. It is by these means that the mind of man, so far as nature allows, achieves that godlike state which is the zenith of blessedness. The Greeks call it telos. You could use the words limit, the ultimate, or end. In that state, man's life lacks nothing. It is a life of absolute, unimpeded blessedness. By means of symbolism, all earthly things are thrown away, and the stuff of matter is cast off. We strip form from form until we reach the primal form, that is, both the form of all things, and yet without form. In this way, so the Kabbalists believe, did God conceive his command at the creation when he said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind," that is, in accordance with the divine idea. Whatever is higher is seen as being pure. In this way, everything in the world below is said to be yellowed, stiff with filth, weighed down with dirt, while in the world above, we can only marvel at the gleaming whiteness, the shine, and the unbelievable appearance of things, and join in its praise by telling it abroad. How much more are we driven to this belief when we see how carefully nature has planted in things that lie, grow, and breathe the instinct to reach upward? Clearly she has not neglected man, the master of all living things, a handsome animal, worthy of respect, the noblest animal, leading all the others, not just wise and knowledgeable, but capable of contemplation and religious feeling. Surely man has been endowed well and holily, and above all given the condition of his race, in which he reaches out for the highest and best with all the strength of which he is able. In making man, God went one better than nature, as is told in the holy story, and fashioned him out of the dust of the earth and the breath of life. And so in his garment of mud, man takes care of his bodily needs, and with the breath of life, he wisely loves divine things. Out of dust, God forms a living soul in his very own image, that is in accordance with the idea peculiar to himself. Born not of brute beasts, nor of plants, nor of stones or trees, but from the mouth of God, whose Spirit breathed into his face his mind's enlightenment. This is what used to be called deification, when exterior sense passes from the immediate object to the inner sense, and that passes to the imagination, imagination to thought, thought to reason, reason to understanding, understanding to reflection, and reflection to the light which enlightens man and clasps to itself that enlightenment. This seems to have been correctly observed by the Cabalists, who thought that the beauty of the physical world should be placed in the middle of the tree by which the 10 Sphirot are numbered, being that great Adam who is like the tree of life in the midst of an ideal paradise, or as they say, like the straight line, the median. For God made man upright according to royal Ecclesiastes, to enable him to attend both the world above and to the world below. He intended man to realize by native wit that he is part of both the elements and of this worldly kingdom, as is shown by the strife and friendship of which Empedocles spoke. But through the fear of God and the hallowing of him, by the fear and loving kindness spread out over him, man can apprehend God in his simplicity through these 3 methods: crown, wisdom, and understanding. This, then, is the end of man, to which nature formed and made him, to walk like the animals with his feet on the ground, but alone of all the creatures to hold discourse, head held high, with the angels in heaven.